Chapter 1 Lavivrus, The Why. 80,000 years ago, a 9-year-old boy named Lavivrus stood up after playing in the dirt and walked over to his father. Tinkler was sitting on a fallen tree below an overhanging limestone rock face. He sat amongst the sounds of the forest, adding his own music with the repetitive tapping of two rocks. An echo climbed the tall walls of the limestone-lined cave and out of a large dome-like opening toward the sky. He paused his arrowhead-making effort while observing the shadow of his son on the ground beneath him. He looked up at the young boy and waited on his intentions. Lavivrus pointed to the dug-out trench in the middle of the cave and said, "Father, where does fire come from?" Tinkler took a deep breath and allowed his eyes to close in reverence. He exhaled and his eyes came back to life. Speaking with an intimidating soft voice, he said, "Fire comes from the elements." Tinkler was the fire master of the village, and as Lavivrus grew up, he observed his father's strong emotion for this mysterious element. "What are the elements?" the boy asked. "Come with me, Lavivrus," replied his father. Tinkler rose to his naked feet and walked slowly in front of his son towards the fire pit. "Sit down," he said to the boy and nodded to the large rock a few feet away from the pit. Tinkler reached into his pouch made from the hide of a mammoth and retrieved 2 large handfuls of dried moss. He placed the tinder on the hot gray coals from earlier that morning. The young boy watched his father's movements closely. "Lavivrus, go into the shelter and bring back all the sticks that you can carry." Lavivrus jumped up from the rock and sprinted around the opening of the cave and down the creek to their home. Tinkler pulled a large wooden scoop from another pouch attached to his waist. He reached deep within the pit and scooped the hot orange embers hidden beneath the cool gray coals. He carefully placed the fiery embers on top of the dried moss and began to blow until they glowed. As Lavivrus came back around the edge of the rock face with a chest full of broken branches, he noticed a tiny flame at the foot of his father. He placed a pile of sticks next to his father, and Tinkler began strategically maneuvering the kindling within the small flame. As the flames grew larger, Tinkler bowed his head in a respectful manner. Tinkler sat down on a charcoal black stump and spoke to his son. "Lavivrus, I will tell you about where fire comes from, but first you must tell me why we need fire." His son replied, "I don't know, so we can see at night?" His father smiled. "Yes, that is true, but then how do we see during the day?" The young boy laughed and exclaimed, "The sun!" His father laughed. "Yes, you are right, Lavivrus. You see, the sun is also a fire, and it was created by our Supreme Being when he created all other elements. The sun gives life to all living things and is meant to enlighten us on a daily basis. Tell me, Lavivrus, why else do we have fire?" Lavivrus thought for a second. "To keep us warm." His father replied, "Yes, and?" His son hesitated. "To cook?" Tinkler said, "Yes, that is very good, son. Fire helps us see, keeps us warm, comforts us, cooks our food, and protects us from predators." Lavivrus had a curious look on his face as he said, "So where does fire come from?" Tinkler replied, "Lavivrus, I must finish making an arrowhead for our hunt this evening. Tomorrow we will rise with the sun, and I will show you the way to the fire you are so curious about. Do you want to come watch me finish the arrowhead?" The boy replied, "No, I want to watch the fire." Tinkler went back to his fallen log and began tapping the rocks together to form his weapon. Lavivrus sat at the fire for the next 2 hours watching it smoke and pulse with light. He observed the fire until it took its very last breath just before nightfall. The young boy was fascinated by fire, and as the Supreme Being's fire dropped between the trees and into the earth, his father's fire expired into burning red coals. As night fell upon the small village, Lavivrus began noticing that other lights were appearing in the dark blue-black sky. The lights blinked softly between wispy camouflage cloud patterns. He began to relate his curiosity with fire to all aspects of his daily living, and his life took on a new meaning. He couldn't wait to continue his fire exploration in the morning with his father. The next morning, as the damp forest began crawling with life, Tinkler and Lavivrus finished consuming the organ meats and bone broth given by the previous night's hunt. They each bowed their heads and gave thanks to the animal that provided their meal. With their new energy from breakfast, they broke fast out of their hut and down a path on the edge of the creek. The sun was beginning to rise and shone enough orange and pink light to show Tinkler the way. Lavivrus smiled as he felt the clean morning air flowing into his nostrils and down through his lungs. The dirt and sediment seemed to be in slow motion as he trailed his father, watching his calloused dark feet penetrate the top layer of the earth. After running a mile, Tinkler began slowing down and Lavivrus followed his example. They walked slowly off the path of the creek and into the forest. Tinkler was breathing slowly and deeply while standing fully erect with his chest raised towards the sky. Lavivrus's breaths were shallow and fast, and his posture was slightly bent. "Lavivrus, breathe slowly and deeply," his father said. Lavivrus noticed his father's posture and imitated his example. They walked through the trees and forest debris on upward sloping terrain until Lavivrus noticed the beautiful colors of the morning sky straight ahead. He soon found himself at the edge of a cliff by his father's side with a ravine of golden forest as far as his eyes could see. "Let's sit down here, Lavivrus," Tinkler said. They both sat down on the soft, moss-padded soil at the edge of the coniferous-lined cliff. "So you want to know about fire, Lavivrus?" "Yes, father. Where does it come from?" the boy replied. "Let me ask you, what is needed to make fire?" Lavivrus replied. "Dried moss and sticks." "That is right. We need the earth element. And what else?" Lavivrus was out of ideas. "I don't know." Tinkler replied, "In order for fire to exist, we need earth, fire, and air." Lavivrus looked confused. "You need fire to make fire?" His father replied, "Yes, you need heat, which is represented by the fire element. Think of the fire element as the sun. Fire represents the energy needed by all living things." Lavivrus smiled. "Yeah, heat, that makes sense." Tinkler replied, "Let me show you." He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small, flat piece of wood with a trench running down the middle. A small hole was notched out in the center of the trench. He turned towards Lavivrus and sat with both of his legs crossed in Indian style. He laid the dead tree bark between him and his son. Tinkler then took out a long, thin, cylindrical piece of wood and a dried clump of moss. "These 3 items came from the earth," he said. Tinkler placed the long, pencil-thin sliver of wood into the notch of the flat, dead tree. He held the stick vertically between the palms of his gigantic hands and began rubbing them back and forth. His hands moved up and down the large stick as he applied downward pressure into the flat piece of wood. He spoke with his eyes closed and head down. "I am creating energy, Lavivrus, the same energy that comes from the sun and gives us light." Smoke began to appear from the point of friction, and Lavivrus moved his body in a position like his father, watching in fascination. Tinkler gently removed the long stick from the notch and picked up the small mass of dried moss. He slowly lifted the flat piece of wood from the earth and tilted it towards the moss. A small glowing ember fell into the moss, and Tinkler cradled it in both hands with a focused intensity. "Now I will add the air element with my breath," he whispered. He slowly began blowing into the tangle of moss and continued blowing stronger and stronger. A small flame suddenly ignited from his hands, and he calmly placed the bundle of lit moss on the ground. Lavivrus smiled as he experienced a true feeling of creation. Tekon said, "Now there is only one element left to add to the fire." He removed a clay vessel attached to the strap on his back and poured water on the flame. "Lavivrus, you must never underestimate the importance of the water element when creating fire. All things must have their dual counterpart. The birth of fire is undoubtedly beautiful, but we must have the ability to realize that its death by water is equally as beautiful." The boy said, "But why would we put the fire out?" His father responded, "Lavivrus, you must understand that life is about balance. Do you enjoy gazing at the moon and the millions of other suns that exist in the night sky?" Lavivrus exclaimed, "Yeah, I love looking at the night sky. Are the stars really suns?" Tekon smirked. "Yes, they are, and if it weren't for the balance in life, the sun would shine its light on us all day long, and we would never experience the beauty in darkness. In the same way, water is our dual counterpart that protects us from the fire. We have the ability to destroy ourselves by overindulging in the gift of the fire element. If we are not careful, we can overcook our food, overheat our bodies, and even lose control of the fire as we watch it scorch all of our other elements. We must be good stewards of the fire that allows us to thrive on earth." "Can you teach me how to make fire?" said Lavivrus. Tekon replied, "Tomorrow we will rise with the sun, and I will let you make the fire as I guide you. You will not create fire during your first attempt. You must not become frustrated, as it will take time before you can create a sun of your own. Even the most masterful keepers of fire never saw flame during their beginning attempts." The young boy said, "Can you build a fire when we get back to the village? I want to watch it while you're gone hunting." Tekon replied, "I will, but when we return, you first must go to the spring to collect water for your mother." Tekon pushed his bare feet into the ground and leaned forward to stand up without the use of his hands. Lavivrus found his own clumsy way to an erect position, and they both progressed into a light trot back to the village.